What's up, sons? It's Blind Red with Son of a Tech once again, and I have another performance versus mashup for you guys. This time it's going to be the GTX 1060 6GB versus the RX 480 8GB, and the game is going to be Gears of War 4, which is going to be awesome, so stick around. So if you guys haven't already seen the comparison video between the GTX 1060 3GB and the RX 470 4GB, definitely check that out by clicking the link in the description or somewhere up here if you have the ability to do that. Getting right into things, we are going to compare resolutions of 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, all with ultra settings turned on. So it's going to be the default ultra settings. You can turn those on or off and check how your system compares to these cards as well. Another note here is that I did do a test in 1080p to see the difference between async on and async off for both AMD and Nvidia and the performance differences that we got there. So to kick it off, we have 1080p with async on. Of course, once again, this is Ultra, and the GTX 1060 6GB has a response time of 11.6 milliseconds, or I should say time between frames. So obviously this number you're going to want lower because that's going to be the time it takes to get from frame 1 to frame 2. The RX 480 went ahead and matched that with its own 11.6 milliseconds of time between the frames. So awesome, both the cards are performing pretty much the same there. That doesn't continue, however, as the minimum frame rate for the GTX 1060 6GB stays above 60 frames per second with 71.1 frames per second, while the RX 480 8GB falls down to 58.3 frames per second. Kind of a bummer, especially when you look at the average here, because the average stays very close on both of these cards, right around 86 frames per second. But that change in frame rate between 58 and 86 compared to the 71 min on the 1060 6GB gives this win to Nvidia. But let's take a look at async here, because maybe with async turned on or off, we can see if the cards perform better with async on, and we can give a win here to maybe AMD. So with async off in 1080p, the time between frames in milliseconds for the 1060 6GB is 11.8 milliseconds, while on the RX 480 8GB it is 12.3 milliseconds. So we do see a bigger improvement in frame timing for the RX 480 with async on than we do with the GTX 1060 6GB. This doesn't really continue, and I was confused here. The minimum frame rate for the GTX 1060 6GB dropped about 6 frames to 65.5 frames per second, yet the minimum on the RX 480 with async off actually went up from 58 frames per second to 64.3 frames per second. The only thing that I could kind of conclude here is that the improvements or the push for the higher average frame rates that are coming from the CPU is causing some instability in frames when it's running, and that's why we see a lower frame rate with async on. Yet the average frame rate is higher with async on, still at 86.2 frames per second with async on, and we drop down about 5 frames per second with async off to 81 frames per second. Just kind of interesting to note those differences there. It does appear that the Nvidia card is performing better with async on than the AMD card, but you got to keep in mind that what you're seeing there is a higher average frame rate, so it almost appears to be that AMD is more dependent upon async at this point. Moving on to 1440p, the rest of these are going to have async on, and the time between frames for the 1060 6GB is 17.8 milliseconds, while the time between frames on the 480 8GB is 18.8 milliseconds. The minimum frame rate for the 1060 is 47.7, and the minimum frame rate for the 480 is 44 frames per second. The averages here are both in the 50s, with the 1060 pulling in 56.1 frames and the 488 gigabyte pulling in 53.4 frames. Both very playable at 1440p. You could probably even pull off some 60 frames per second goodness by turning settings down to high. Moving on to the Big Daddy, once again we have 4K resolution. Now, we're still just at that point where 4K is sort of unattainable unless you're going to be throwing bukus of money at a Titan XP at this point. But for sake of comparison, the 1066 gigabyte had 36.5 milliseconds between frames, while the 480 had 38.7 milliseconds between frames. Both of them had a minimum average frame rate of 23.7 or 22 frames per second. Yeah. So the 1060 had a minimum frame rate of 23.7 frames per second, while the 480 had a minimum frame rate of 22 frames per second. The averages are about the same, where the 1060 pulls in 27.4 frames per second and the 480 pulls in 25.9 frames per second. So all in all, both of these cards showed to be performing pretty well in Gears of War 4. I don't think you're going to have any trouble running the game, whether you're on the green team or the red team. And both the cards are awesome, so I don't have any problem with you buying either or. I'm not going to get into that argument. One note is that the RX 480 was using about half a gig of RAM less throughout all the tests than the 1066 gigabyte, which is kind of weird because there's more available RAM on the RX 480. That could be an optimization thing that gets worked out later, and we might see some better frames. And that does appear to cause some significant differences within frame rates, as well as a significant difference within the frame times. Now, some of this could be tied to the tiled resources options within the menus, and apparently that feature does seem to favor NVIDIA, and what that feature does is it is able to keep more data or textures within the actual video memory than if that option was turned off. So thanks for watching, guys. I will leave a link to the individual reviews of these graphics cards above me and in the description below. And if you haven't yet, check out the comparison of the RX 474 gigabyte and the 1063 gigabyte. But there's also one for Forza that you can check out, performance benchmarks in that. If you guys have any game requests, please leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next Tuesday.